The courtroom was so silent that you could hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Everyone's eyes were locked on the man standing in the witness box, Michael Turner. His hands trembled as he gripped the wooden edge before him. His lawyer whispered for him to stop talking, but Michael's voice broke through the air, shaking and raw. "I killed her," he said. Gasps filled the room. The judge's gavel slammed down once, twice, but the sound didn't matter. Everyone had already heard what they weren't supposed to. The reporters stopped typing. The prosecutor froze mid-sentence. Even the jury, who had been looking half-bored moments earlier, now sat upright, eyes wide, mouths slightly open. Michael Turner, a quiet schoolteacher, accused of only helping in a crime, had just confessed to murder in front of the entire courtroom. But then he said something else. Something that made even the judge drop his pen. "She didn't die the way you think." And before anyone could ask what he meant, Michael looked straight at the victim's brother sitting in the front row and whispered, "You know what happened, don't you, Eric?" The room erupted. The judge ordered silence. Reporters scrambled to get their microphones closer. The defense attorney grabbed Michael's arm, begging him to stop. But the damage was done. The confession had changed everything. No one in that room could have guessed the truth behind those words. And none of them were prepared for the story Michael was about to tell. 3 months earlier, the story began quietly, in a small town called Bridgeview, a peaceful community where nothing truly bad ever seemed to happen. Michael Turner had been a high school English teacher for almost 10 years. He was known as calm, patient, and always willing to help his students. The victim, Rachel Moore, was one of his former students, a bright young woman who had recently graduated and started college. Everyone in town loved Rachel. She volunteered at the animal shelter, sang in the church choir, and had plans to study law. So, when she was found dead near the woods behind her home one cold October morning, the entire town of Bridgeview changed overnight. At first, no one even suspected Michael. He had no criminal record, no history of violence. But things started to look strange when investigators discovered his fingerprints on Rachel's car door and her phone. Michael said she had come to his house the night before to ask for advice about college, but the police weren't buying it. Then they found something worse, a text message from Rachel's phone sent the night she disappeared. "I'm scared. He's not who I thought he was." That was all the police needed to arrest Michael Turner. The town that once smiled at him now whispered behind his back. Parents pulled their children from his class. News vans lined up in front of his house. His wife, Laura, cried every night, insisting Michael would never hurt anyone. But as the trial grew closer, even she began to look uncertain. Inside the courtroom, the prosecutor painted Michael as a manipulative man, someone who used his position of trust to get close to Rachel. They said he killed her when she tried to expose him for something dark. Michael sat there, barely blinking, as witness after witness took the stand. The evidence looked bad. Too bad. But Michael's lawyer, David Allen, kept saying there was more to the story, that someone else was involved. Someone who had a reason to frame Michael. The problem was they had no proof. Then came Eric Moore, Rachel's older brother. He was angry, shaking with rage. He looked Michael in the eye and said, "You took my sister's life." Michael didn't respond. Not then. But that moment, that quiet stare, was when something inside him broke. 3 weeks later, on the 4th day of the trial, Michael told his lawyer he wanted to testify. Against advice, he took the stand. He said he couldn't live with the lie anymore. Everyone expected him to deny everything, to beg for mercy. Instead, he confessed. But the way he said it, it wasn't guilt that filled his eyes. It was fear. "I killed her," he said again, voice shaking, "but it wasn't supposed to happen that way. You don't understand, she wasn't alone that night." The courtroom went silent again. Everyone stared at him, waiting for what would come next. And that's when Michael turned toward Eric, his eyes burning with something between sorrow and anger. "She didn't die because of me," he said. "She died because of what you did." The judge shouted for order, reporters shouted questions, and Laura, Michael's wife, stood up in tears. But Michael just sat back down, hands trembling, as if a terrible weight had finally been lifted off his chest. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. And no one knew what was true anymore. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Reporters whispered into their phones, jurors glanced at one another, and Eric Moore sat frozen, his face pale. The judge demanded silence again, his gavel striking hard enough to echo through every corner of the room. "Mr. Turner," the judge said, his voice tight. "Are you saying the victim's brother was involved in her death?" Michael didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, then back up at Eric. "I'm saying," he began softly, "that she called me that night because she was afraid of him." Gasps spread again. The defense attorney rushed forward, pleading with Michael to stop talking. "Michael, please don't." But Michael kept going. "She said Eric had been following her for days. She thought he was protecting her, but he wouldn't leave her alone. That night, she came to me crying. She said he'd found out about something she planned to tell the police." The judge frowned. "Something?" Michael nodded. "Rachel found out Eric was selling pills, not just small stuff, real drugs. She said she had proof, and she was going to turn him in. I told her to calm down, that we'd go to the police together in the morning." He paused, voice shaking. "But before I could, he showed up." Everyone turned toward Eric. His jaw clenched tight, his eyes darting between Michael and the prosecutor. "He's lying," Eric said, his voice cracking. "He's trying to save himself." Michael stood now, emotion surging. "You were there that night, Eric. You grabbed her, you shouted at her. She slipped and hit her head on the rock. You panicked. You thought she was dead. You made me help you move her." Eric shot up from his seat, shouting, "You killed her!" The courtroom broke into chaos. The judge shouted for order, officers rushed forward, and Michael's wife sobbed quietly in the back row. Finally, the judge ordered a recess. Both men were escorted out, Eric shouting, Michael silent, eyes hollow. Outside the courtroom, the air buzzed with news cameras and flashing lights. Was the confession real? Is the brother involved? What really happened to Rachel Moore? Reporters crowded around anyone who would talk. Meanwhile, inside a small interrogation room, Michael sat across from two detectives. His lawyer sat beside him, pale and exhausted. "Tell us everything," one detective said. And Michael did. He told them how Rachel called him that night in tears. How Eric had been waiting outside her house. How he came to his door minutes later, desperate, saying something bad had happened. "I followed him into the woods," Michael said quietly. "Rachel was lying there, not moving. Eric said she tripped, that it was an accident. But when I looked closer, I saw bruises on her neck. He begged me not to call the police. He said no one would believe it was an accident." "So why didn't you call 911? The detective asked. Michael looked down. "Because I was scared. He threatened me. Said he'd blame it on me. Said he'd tell everyone I was having an affair with Rachel. I didn't know what to do. I just froze." He rubbed his temples, his voice barely above a whisper. "I helped him move her because I thought she was already gone. But she wasn't. I heard her breathe." The room went silent. "What did you just say?" the detective asked. Michael looked up, his eyes red. "She was alive. She tried to say something. Eric told me to leave. I did. I drove home and waited for morning. When I went back, the police were already there." Later that evening, detectives confronted Eric Moore with the story. At first, he denied everything, said Michael was making it all up. But then they showed him the photo evidence, Rachel's blood on his jacket, phone records placing him near the woods that night, and a voicemail Rachel had left for her friend just hours before her death. In the message, her voice shook with fear. "If something happens to me, it's not Mr. Turner. Please, tell them." Eric broke down. He confessed that he'd gone to her house to stop her from talking to the police. They argued she ran into the woods, tripped, and hit her head. When he realized she was still alive, he panicked. He thought if he called for help, they'd arrest him. So he left her there, cold and alone. 2 weeks later, the trial resumed. This time, Michael was no longer the accused. He was a witness. The courtroom was packed again, the air still heavy with what had happened. Eric sat at the defense table, hands cuffed, eyes hollow. When Michael took the stand again, the judge asked him one final question. "Why did you confess to something you didn't do?" Michael hesitated. Because I felt guilty anyway, he said softly. If I'd called for help that night, maybe Rachel would still be alive. The courtroom was silent again, but this time, not out of shock. Out of grief. Eric was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Michael was released, but his life would never be the same. He resigned from teaching, moved away from Bridgeview, and spent the rest of his days quietly, visiting Rachel's grave every year on her birthday. And though the truth had finally been told, some in Bridgeview still whispered about that night, about guilt, silence, and what it truly means to confess. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes, it just makes you live with what you could have changed.